it used to be, back in the day, it used to be a place where we used to go post rave. So we would do like after parties in the cemetery, and it was so magical. We would go out at night to this club called Chaos, and then in the morning go straight there, quite a few of us. And it's a place filled with with peace and kind of magic for me. And it's also cruising ground. So people now, it's getting more and more, I would say, like, it's being domestified. I mean, I don't know if that's even a word, but it's like it's
gentrified almost.
Gentrified, yeah. I mean, it's like the whole of London, but like it's. I mean, some people still go cruising there. Cruising, you know, I mean, having sex. Yeah, of course, yeah. Yeah. I mean, I have quite a sort of a special story there with the pandemic, because I remember that I was really scared during the pandemic in terms of, you know, getting COVID and all these things. And I was one of the people that was washing their, you know, the Amazon packages. I know I shouldn't be getting Amazon, but I do sometimes. And, you know, like putting them, leaving them for 2 hours.
Yeah.
Like I had a friend coming in and we would speak through my window that I would open, you know, window that would lead to the outside, and give him a coffee, like really mad. And it was so maddening that this sort of separation. I lived alone, not far from the cemetery. And I remember one day just being really it was too much for me, the whole pandemic thing and being so isolated. So I went there, and all of a sudden I was like walking around the park, and then this person was cruising me, this man. And I just felt really just kind of seen and kind of shocked that, you know, I hadn't been with anyone for such a long time and all of these things. And all of a sudden, I went towards him, and we went inside this place, and I hugged him. So it was like a very affective cruise, you know, like I hugged him with all my might because I needed a hug so badly. Wow. So it was like a kind of, and then that's when I broke the kind of the hyper paranoid state that I was in for so long with this person that was this random passerby, you know. All of a sudden, this kind of heightened hypervigilance of.
And he hugged you as well.
Yeah, I mean, we hugged each other, like, you know, like in this embrace that sorted me out. Like it took me out of this, you know, complete paranoia that I was in with COVID, you know, particularly at the beginning of COVID. Yeah. So it was a very, very good moment for me and then I snapped out, and then I started feeling that I could, you know, walk more outside, get in contact with people, and start just coming back to some kind of.
I wonder what did COVID do? It had that psychological element where suddenly it's like you're a child and you're suddenly in your room that you're comfortable in, and you don't need to go anywhere, and there is no pressure to you kind of, there's a coziness that was created by sort of force. And then
I wouldn't say
for some people it was something, there was something comfortable in that.
I mean, it started for me at a place of comfort, and then it became a bit of a full-on kind of hermit disaster for me. Yeah, a bit like too separated from the world, too separated from other people, particularly if you lived alone, which was my case at the time. And yeah, for me, I went really far with inside my head, just really kind of, you know, end of the world scenarios, you know. Yeah, it was a bit mad for me. Yeah.
It's interesting because actually I started this project, it wasn't really the end of COVID. It was just when we thought it was the end, but then it got extended and extended. And, you know, obviously like this format is very, it actually reminds us of COVID times. But I wonder if there is any potential in it. Yeah, I don't know. There's something, the reason why then I thought maybe it's the way to do this is to actually stick to that format where we're both in our spaces and then we're talking via Zoom, is that maybe, you know, maybe there's something about that private space that we should take from COVID.
I mean, that's definitely, you know, there's definitely been a positive with, you know, how things, or how, I mean, how much access has been created to things like this. You know what I mean? Like people just started streaming so much really incredible things, including all your, you know, your programming and so many other people as well. And I think in that case, it's really beautiful. You know, it's there's so much beautiful, incredible stuff online at the moment, and people keep on using the format. So in that sense, yeah, absolutely, I'm all for it. Yeah.
Okay, so maybe the first, if we get into some of the things that I was hoping to talk about, and maybe one of them connects to the home, but also maybe connects to one of your most recent work, which is the dust bathers. And it's just something that is very homely, is dust. I remember meeting someone Indian who then I had given, well, we were looking at some object in my house, and that object had a nice layer of dust on top of it. And then I obviously had to apologize for the dust, to which he said, "Oh, don't worry, dust is a part of life." I was like, "Oh, that's nice. That's nice." He really addressed the dust, you know, as something that is a part of life. And I don't know whether it's cultural. I mean, we didn't go too much into cultural kind of understanding or perception of dust. But I don't know, is there something in dust being a part of life, or dust being this thing that covers our
everything that we are kind of always trying to get rid of? And I think absolutely. I mean, for me, it's really funny because I was just talking like 10 minutes ago with one of the curator Ashley Joyner from Queer Circle. The whole room right now at Queer Circle, where this exhibition is taking place, is fully covered now. And all of these kind of people that came by, not all of them, but many of them have been making drawings. And I'm always obsessed. In southern Spain, we have this kind of storms that bring a bit of sand from the Sahara, and they cover all the cars. Everything gets dirt, you know, like everything. So then everyone is like making drawings on people's windows, you know, like on the cars, for example, you know, like little anecdotes. And I always photograph them for many, many years. Like it's this sort of little moment that you're kind of allowed to touch someone else's property and leave a mark on it. But at the same time, it's kind of, you can laugh at the person, or you can make a little, I don't know, it's like some kind of intimacy there that I was always very sort of, I get hooked on these things, these little moments of intimacy that you trespass something, but you're not really trespassing. You're kind of entering the outer layer of a belonging of someone else and leaving your marking on that layer. And I think there's something really delicate in the fragility of that. And it usually disappears quite quickly, you know, because dust can be cleaned off so fast. So for me, yeah, like this dirty thing has been, it's always in the back of my head, this dirt. I love the patina of dirt on things, particularly like I need that dirtiness. You know, I go like to markets that are like street markets, and when the street is full at the end of the day with, you know, fruits and all of these things, that patina somehow brings me back to life. And it's, you know, I'm kind of, the hygienization of everything is the hygienization also of our minds. And it's sort of, yeah, I'm kind of constantly trying to go to those surfaces at an immediate level, but then also at a kind of, let's say, deeper level, going to those things that we want to get rid of around us, you know, those things that we don't want people to see, that we don't want to show. And then you start getting into all sorts of metaphors around, you know, the self and aspects of the self that are less clean and tidy. And so dirt becomes this hyper meaningful kind of territory for me.
Yeah, but so how do you, let's say, clean your house?
I'm really dirty. I'm like, I mean, I'm dirty. I'm really clean, and then it goes into a mess, and then it's like I have to tidy up again. I'm not like a regular type cleaning person. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
I'm very tidy, and then I'm really messy, and then I have to go back to really tidy. I wish I was more like constantly semi-tidy.
For example, your dishes, or how often do you do your dishes?
Well, now I'm better. Now I'm better. I mean, I'm going to be 40 this year, and it's like, I think it's taken me 40 years to get around this thing of like, it's kind of funny. It's kind of, for me, what I have with dirt and with how dirt accumulates is that I avoid seeing it. There's a kind of thing in my head. I get very excited by things. That's one of my things, for the good and the bad.
That's why I'm asking, because it looks like there is an excitement in it, but so it must have an impact on your everyday, or your daily routine.
It does. I mean, this is what happens. I'm going to be really real with you. Like, what happens is I get very excited by things, but not about dirt in my house. So what happens is that I'm doing stuff, like I'm writing on, thinking on, doing whatever it is that I'm doing. And then things pile up. So like, all of a sudden I don't see the dishes, or I don't see the floor, you know? And then what happens at some point, I'm like in my sofa, just sitting down, and then I look and I'm like, oh shit, you know, like what has happened? You know, all of these things have piled up, and all of these things that then I have to kind of deal with. But at a kind of more practical art level, the dirt, it's very core in my practice. So it's sort of all these traces that are constantly happening around the work is very often where the work is at. And what I mean here is like, I could be making a drawing and then spill a cup, like, you know, this cup of coffee, and sorry. And for example, with Lawrence Sillars, the director of the Henry Moore, when I was working on this big milk work, when I was speaking with him, I had spilled this ginormous, like the whole, like, you know, pot of milk on the floor, you know, and after a day after, and I'm like, oh, this is meant to happen. So I just wrote to Lawrence, I'm like, the milk has been spilled. And then I took a few images, and I'm like, and then I went to the streets and I was doing this test with milk on the road near my house, you know, small tests. So it's like all of these sort of accidents, dirty accidents, are like constantly hovering around the work, and it's like the most fertile place in my practice, I would say, rather than when I try to concentrate and be very logistic and kind of linear. What happens is something happens on the periphery of that, and then that's what I then have to go to and gather. It happens all the time. It's like I'm trying to go there, but the things are happening here in the dirty parts.
Yeah, I guess that's where dirt goes, because dirt almost has always moved away from our sort of usual trajectory, right? The usual trajectory, because there is traffic. Dirt doesn't accumulate there. It always goes to the edges.
Totally.
It is interesting, and you know, actually, the thought about the everyday is to do with not necessarily living your own art, but because presumably that can be a bit overwhelming, starting to then you know, every time you sort of get up in the morning and look at your sink and it's a bit dirty or whatever, that you're kind of going through like a process of like a creative understanding something new, or coming up with like a new idea. That's maybe a bit too much, but then there is an element of that.
Art is too much. I think art is very overwhelming for me. It's a very overwhelming way of being in the world, and it is too much. The whole thing is, for me, art is quite maddening and quite overwhelming and quite extreme as a kind of behavior and practice. But I mean it in a good way. You know, it's an excessive interaction with the world for me, you know, excessive. By that, I mean, my sensorial body can get hyperactivated by what art can do and move and all of these things. But I think it's a gift of it. You know what I mean? Like last night I went to the show at the Barbican of a friend, Prajal Harel, and I, you know, moved to tears. I moved to almost like a kind of sort of, how would I say, like an explosion of life in it's a trilogy piece, and the last show was just so life-giving. And you know, what a gift. And then I was just thinking, what a gift that I can live in London and that I have access to these kind of incredible things that are happening. I mean, but other times I'm you know, sort of extraordinarily exhausted by this city and all it takes from us. But it's at other times it gives us so much as well. This is crazy give and take that this career. I mean, I don't even want to call it a career. This thing called art. You know.
But how do you switch? Do you ever switch off? Do you ever find a moment where you're like a normal person?
I mean, I don't know. I mean, when I go to Spain, I have my beautiful moments when I'm in the beach alone, very often with a book, and I really try to go to some quite secluded beaches in southern Spain, in Almeria and in Cádiz, these parts of Andalusia, and just be there. And it's very soothing for me, the water, and like for many people, you know, just be in the water and read and feel. The sun is really soothing for me. I grew up near the water, near this, well, lots of sun in southern Spain, in Malaga, where I'm from. So it's like a kind of, it's a space in which I don't have to think much. The sun kind of makes me, it calms me down. It kind of my I don't know if you call it sympathetic system or my path. I calm down, you know, all of a sudden I'm like, oh, I don't have to think much. The sun somehow takes over, you know, when you're resting.
It blinds you.
It blinds you, and then you're in this kind of state of being, temporarily, of course, but it's sort of, I think that's what the summer used to be for, at least for me. You know, in southern Spain it's so hot that the summer you have to switch off and let this big thing, which is the sun, kind of take over your whole body, your whole being. You can't do anything against, I mean, you can't do, like, apart from people that get air conditioning or something, but it's like, you can't really, you know, defend yourself from it. All you can do is defeat and lie down and like bake, you know? And it's kind of like, I love being baked by the sun, you know. I don't know how good it is for my skin, but it's like, that chills me so much, you know.
So I think that's really quite something, that there is this, that there is something that can remove almost everything else.
Dancing as well.
At least for a moment, you know.
Dancing as well makes me feel, like dancing makes me feel, I don't know, out of my head and back really into my body in a very.
So we said that we would maybe want to talk about a club scene that you immersed in for many years. Is dancing related to it, or is dancing just an element of it?
I think it's a central part of it, you know, but dance is so many things. You know, dance is a body in place with other bodies. It's a space in which there's a kind of a parenthesis to more, I don't know, like kind of separate ways of being. You know, we give the chance when we're in a club or in a rave or in a kind of space like that for our bodies to be more porous to ourselves, but to others too, to be seen sweating, to be seen, you know, kind of in shapes that are like, you know, not so structured, like the shape that you and I are right now holding. You know, we're trying to look as people who are holding a conversation. When you're dancing, it can be beautiful, it can be awkward, it can be all of these incredible things. And I think that's what kind of really helped me with dance. Like dance, since I was very young, like it's this space that helps me. It's like access things that I can't access in other ways. You know, it's like non-verbal, hyper bodily, and then there we are, all of these people just almost at times in a kind of trance-like state. You know what I mean? And I think we're lucky in London that we have this, well, we had, I mean, we still have, but, you know, there are issues right now with a lot of spaces that are disappearing. Yeah.
But is dance connected to a certain time in life, a certain age, certain moment?
It was, but it's still in my heart. It's still a place that I can access, and I can still go out dancing and access a lot of the things that I was accessing back in the day. And I mean, for me, dance was a very central way of freeing myself up from a lot of the constraints that I grew up with. I arrived in London age 18, or I think 18, yeah. And I discovered like the club scene. I mean, first with the drum and bass scene in South London. I moved to Brixton, and very luckily, a second cousin of mine, she kind of opened this beautiful world of drum and bass, emceeing and all of this. At the time, it was quite a straight sort of environment, heterosexual environment. But very luckily, my cousin had this friend who became my boyfriend, and he was part of this scene. And, you know, it's just such a wealth of sounds and space, and we will go out to so many places and raves as well. And that, for me, coming from a small town in southern Spain, was like miraculous, you know. It was a miracle to see these people doing this incredible stuff. And then I started coming more to East London in the mid-2000s. So it's kind of, I mean, central. There was a sort of electro trash scene. So we had like Nag 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 on Wednesdays and The Cock on Fridays. And there were these clubs, you know, like I was a child, but, you know, there was one day like Bjork was DJ. You know what I mean? Like I was this kid. Then you bump into Wolfgang Tillmans when you're like, you know, this queer person, you're like, oh, wow, my heroes are here, you know, like at the time. And then, yeah, you just, you know, you dress up as well. We all dressed up so much. And it's quite miraculous, London, in that way. And then from then, slowly, the East, there were clubs like Family, Boombox later. And then outside of that, there was Chaos, which is a very central aspect of my life. Chaos is run by Lee Adams. It's an incredible artist, curator, and DJ. And Chaos was run in Stunners, which was a club that's disappeared in Limehouse. And it was also a sex club. And it was just a really beautiful place in which me and a family of people, we were so free for quite a few years. And it was like a living room, but not, you know, it felt very domestic. And it was a space for so many possibilities. And yeah, that lasted a few years. And a lot of rain as well, yeah.
You talk about it with a sense of beauty and comfort and homeliness. And it's interesting that sometimes the club scene could seem quite alien or uncomfortable place. There is sometimes an appearance that is maybe rejecting of the sort of value system that is present just in culture, in the kind of general culture. So there is something counter cultural in
yes.
club scene, but there's also something anti-cultural.
Very anti in all of these places. I mean, in most of these places. I mean, it was domestic and cute in that all of us, well, many of us that were together in these groups were rejecting a lot of things, you know. There were very strong standpoints against a lot of things that were very anarchic. And particularly, like, on top of that, I used to go to quite a few raves and the queer squatting scene. We had this amazing, some of the most beautiful parties called Behind Bars, which were run in squats around London. And, you know, we were all friends. And there was what I mean by the domestic and the coziness is that we all knew each other quite well. So there's a kind of intimacy between the organizers and us.
And trust. Presumably there is trust.
And trust as well. And sensuality. It was just some of the most amazing people I met. Some of my partners I met in these spaces and lovers and just, I think there was a connection between space, people, and anarchy that was very kind of conducive to spaces of love and to care and madness and all of this stuff. And yeah, I guess I do miss a bit of that sometimes. But now it's also a different moment.
And is that a space of the moment? Does it do the spaces reflect the moment in time?
Well, absolutely. You know, there were times in which back then people, you know, I had a lot of partners that were squatting, and, you know, those were the policies that were allowed by the British government at the time. And so we could take over spaces. I mean, incredible spaces. Like one of the last ones was in a giant building in Elephant and Castle. My ex-partner had built, like it was a squad, and he had built like a kind of wooden, that's when I met him, a wooden tree house. Well, not tree house, but like a wooden hut inside this building. And I saw him like, it was so beautiful. Like I saw him in the dance floor. He had a partner at the time, and I saw him and I was like, who's him? And I asked his friend, Christian, I'm like, who's that person? And they're like, it's this person. And I ended up there with him that night, and in this hut, you know, with it. And I remember him so beautifully because there was one of these cheap electric heaters, you know, the ones that have this horrible lighting, but they give a really good light, like golden, kind of reddish. Yeah. So I remember like walking into this wooden hut, and there's this beautiful person being lit by this, you know, horrid cheap light, cheap heater. And it was just, it's another of these kind of magical images that I have from that time. And yeah, it's yeah, I speak with a lot of warmth about that time, even though at the end I also wasn't able to kind of stay within that scene. I lasted a few years, but then I had to leave. At some point, I decided to leave London. That was in 2010. After a lot of years in which I felt that I couldn't cope with the city and with my lifestyle, and I mean,
yeah, that's maybe the question, is that it seems to be so consuming that it's almost like the thing that you do.
The thing that you what? Sorry,
it's almost the thing that you do. It's almost so. You know, it's
like a profession. Yeah,
like a profession. I mean, exactly. I'm trying to get you to say that, you know.
It's like a job, exactly.
But it sounds like a job. Yeah.
It's like a full-time job, exactly. It's
and
like
obviously a job is something that consumes you, you know. Job is something that that your energy goes into, and it takes your energy, the job. And so this must have taken energy, you know.
A lot of energy and a lot of, exactly. It was a lot of it. It was a commitment, you know, like a big commitment in my life. And at some point I just decided that I needed a little bit of a big change, because I felt that it became monotone at some point. That was the other side of this, you know, this CD, you know, or this album. So I then, what I did is I went back to Goldsmiths. I had dropped out of Goldsmiths. I did my BA there twice. I dropped out twice, and was one of these students. He's kind of hilarious, and I'm doing a PhD now, like at Oxford. It's like, back then I was a bit of a rebel, and I had dropped out twice out of my BA at Goldsmiths. And then after a series of things, I decided, okay, like art is a serious thing for me, you know, like it always was, but I decided to kind of do a different commitment, you know, from the clubbing to the art. So I went back to Goldsmiths. I did my year 3 of BA. I graduated, and I left the country. I moved to Mexico City with a very kind of big, kind of resolute sort of rearrangement of.
Why was it difficult to finish your BA?
Oh God, I mean, for a lot of reasons. I have a disability that affects my vision. It's a neuroocular condition called visual snow. So sometimes reading, I mean, now I'm much better, but the reading and writing can be quite complex at times. Particularly then, my disability was quite severe. So I wasn't really able to do a lot of the writing at the time. So that's why I'm laughing now that I'm doing a PhD at Oxford. You know, it's like the maddest thing. And then I went back and I did an MFA, and I got one of the highest marks in my thesis. So it's this kind of, the life is funny. You know what I mean? You just don't know how things are going to turn out. But I do have I live with some disabilities, and one of them is this writing thing that can, at the time, was quite severe. So I was sort of really just not able to do the course. And I mean, I was also quite a rebellious thing. I was very anti-academic at the time. And
well, that's what I'm thinking, because you know, there must also be something, a response to an environment or...
For sure. I was very anarchic, you know, I was very anarchic, and Goldsmiths gave me the freedom as well to be anarchic. You know what I mean?
That's another thing. I mean, art education surely is the most understanding of all forms of education, or that's a misconception?
I think it used to be. Now I'm not sure anymore. Now I'm being a bit, I hope it becomes that again. I really do. But there's a lot at stake at the moment without education in the UK, particularly, you know, there's a lot at stake financially. If you enter into a BA, MFA, financially.
How do you succeed? How do you succeed and how do you fail? What's the you know, what's the marker of, I mean, not so much success, that's kind of easy. But what's the mark of failure?
I think failure is not making the art. And I think this is, for me, you know, it's a very personal response, but I think there's so many people that they cannot keep up with the art. And it's not a failure, it's just a kind of a response to the difficulty that this profession is long-term. At the beginning, it sounds and looks kind of like a kind of very possible thing, but then things get real the older you get, and kind of, I mean, maybe the word failure is too tough, but it's a tough one to keep going, you know, after a few years, to keep the business going, particularly if you make different beyond wall works, you know what I mean? Beyond two-dimensional works, it can be a complicated endeavor for many of us. And I think, no, I mean, for me, the triumph is keeping going, you know? It's a marathon, it's not a sprint. Art is always a marathon. It's a long-term, long marathon of daily activity that just, and it's in the walk that the kind of the triumph is happening. It's by keeping going. That,
so is it part of the rigor and stamina that you have to make things? Do you feel, or it's a duty, you know?
It's a duty. I mean, I think it's a maddening profession. Like I was telling you before, it's like a kind of addiction. Art is like a weird addiction that many of us get hooked on, and you just keep on at it. You know, it's like you keep on going back to the sugar, like whatever, if you're hooked on sugar. It's this thing that you never really succumb, I think, or many of us don't succumb, and you just get stuck in it. And, you know, it's sort of, I find it like a really strange, beautiful, quirky addiction to have, you know, and it's like, you just keep at it, even though there's a lot of, particularly if you live in a big city, you know, like, and I don't know what it would be like to be in, like, I don't know, some kind of countryside, making painting and having a very different lifestyle. But in the city like London, where this, you know, the kind of financial stakes are quite high in terms of keeping a studio running and all of these things, it's sort of, you know, it's a strange road to take, but one that somehow keeps so many of us going and coming back, you know. Yeah.
And it is important, right? Because you know, artists capture, you know, something that might be coming. They're in conversation with a different sort of level of consciousness. So it's interesting sometimes to think about these things that maybe show in art first and then start to permeate culture.
I think that's really beautiful, Marko, what you just said, because we talked the other day when we met, you talked about bracketing, no? You were talking about phenomenology and bracketing, that somehow you have to bracket things that will impose a blockage in thinking more imaginatively. And I think art is a really strong bracket of possibility. And I think, like I was saying before last night, that I was so transfixed by the work of Troja Harel, because he was for example, is a person that he's been questioning a lot of postmodern darts, and he said, you know, you had Yvonne Rainer saying not a trio A, so it's a manifesto of no's, and he turned that no into a maybe. And I think that's the kind of a lot of them, you know, the kind of methodology that I also use in myself. What's a maybe? You know, what's a maybe in terms of permission? So art for me is this kind of methodology of creating new permission, you know, and I think a lot of artists can and operate in that kind of thing of allowing certain permissions to take place to themselves and to others and in their work as well. And I think that's maybe, you know, like what you're saying about kind of different states of consciousness, maybe that's what artists, at least the artists that I like, are doing to me. They're allowing me to see a kind of a certain site in which I am blocked, and I can open up space for myself.
I mean, we do live in a society that seems to be very good at creating no's, creating constraints in terms of how you can speak about certain things. A lot of it is to do with offending or not offending groups of people, and in that the openness is being constrained. And I remember, I mean, we touched on this last time we spoke, but I do remember meeting someone very religious, not very recently, but in the last couple of years, and actually realizing that maybe, and obviously in the first instance being almost, I'd say I was intrigued by that level of religiosity or fiction that was associated with it. But then I actually realized that maybe that's the limit of my openness, and that if I'm really to be open, and if I'm really to actually transcend myself to some other place or explore another idea, that's where I need to be. That's what I need to be open about. So sometimes you kind of disregard certain views of the world. And of course, we also live in an extreme world where there are a lot of extreme views and quite destructive ones. But I think there are also areas where we could be a little bit more open. And I sometimes wonder whether, sure, in art, there is something about transcending to another sort of level of consciousness, and within there, or within some subjects, finding interesting things or subjects for thought. But then also it's about being open. And I wonder whether art is still open, you know?
I think art is. And for a while I was thinking that it wasn't. I thought that it was getting a bit constipated and just a bit uptight, but actually, no. Actually, I think there's people just doing quite incredible stuff that are kind of transgressing these spaces, like you said, that are closing doors. You know, I think some people are finding the vocabulary or the key or the permission to transgress this ongoing, growing blockades that are happening worldwide, you know, as you say, in contemporary times. But and that's why I think I also keep going. You know, it's sort of, there's all of a sudden when I find one of these blocks, there's someone that's crossed them or found a way in or found a different way. And what you were saying before about religion and kind of spirituality and all of these things, it's sort of, I don't know what your experience was when you were growing up in Serbia, but my experience, I grew up in southern Spain, and in 1975 we had Franco, he passed, and you know, so we have this hyper sort of kind of extreme response to what that trauma became, but that response to that trauma, that traumatic response to that, closed a lot of possibility as well in terms of other states of being, you know. So people became quite cold to, let's say, practices, magical practices even, you know, like anything that touched slightly on the religious, and particularly in Spain, anything that was touching too close to the folklore of, you know, the kind of what southern Spain was seen like. You know, in Spain, we wanted to be northern after Franco. The socialism was like looking north and copying the north and rejecting anything south, southern being, you know, kind of Francoist. So it's sort of, what I'm trying to share here is that was attached also to a religiosity, but on the periphery of that religiosity, there was a lot, there are and is a lot of folklore and kind of practices. And quite fertile things that slowly I feel now there's a new openness to them after a lot of years of traumatic response, you know, in Spain. Yeah. And in the UK too, slowly.
Yeah, no, absolutely, actually, and there is a resurgence of spirituality or acceptance of, or even an interest in some signs from the universe. Or, but you're right, even here.
It's also with with the decolonial movement. I think finally, the West is looking beyond the Enlightenment and finally accepting other ways of
the supremacy of science, or
the white supremacy, basically. And white supremacy, it's I've seen it in academic circles too. Only academic in recent years, like now you've got people talking about vibrant matter and all of these things, but it's like it's taking quite a while to accept, this sort of other forms of connectivity to the world beyond us that are non-white and non-Western, And I think now, fortunately, these things are being we're having more porosity in the UK towards that. And I think it's a good time. It's a good time for thinking about consciousness in the UK, I think that's really exciting stuff. I'm working with a colleague, a really good friend of mine, Michele Ocelli, who's a hypnotherapy, and we're sort of working through trance states and slowly just thinking about what it means to go into descent, to go into instead of going into the light, there's always this constant idea, let's go towards the light, to this illumination, like what it means to descend into darkness and soil, and kind of, I call it a descension, but it's kind of going into the dirt, So we're working on this workshop that we hopefully will be developing soon, like it's just going inside dirt, literally, our own dirt.
Going into a darker place.
Of more opaque places, and places like you were just going back to the cleanliness. When we clean, we're tidying up the things that we don't want to see, and maybe the things that we don't want other people to see, like when you excuse yourself for having dust in one of the objects. And I think let's go to what that dust means to you, and that the kind of the shamefulness of that, and that of course is attached to marginal communities and queer communities, and what it means to be in the world outside of heteronormative and so on and so forth. And it's kind of, there's so many people discovering just quite incredible things. And I'm like enchanted right now with the possibilities of that. I'm reading Paul Preciado's new book, Dysphoria Mundi. I think it's going to be translated to English very soon. And when I read it, I'm full of fire, because Jack Halberstam as well at the moment, these trans philosophers, they're like changing epistemology. We're like at a shifting point, I think, in which everything is.
Yeah. I think it's important to acknowledge that actually this country that we're both in does have a tradition in spirituality with, the tarot reformulated in this country with all the stone circles and beliefs attached to those. So it is interesting that.
I grew up, as I said, in southern Spain, but my mother was Welsh, and I would come to Wales to a town called Brecon. So there's a national park called Brecon Beacons, and it was very fortunate because I had access to this forest near where my granddad lived, and there was this girl called Holly, and like she would take me in these walks in this forest with little waterfalls and all these like greenery, which in southern Spain in the summer is like completely wiped out. Just everything is golden, not burnt, but like this golden wheat-like colored. Everything is just turning to that. There's no green. And then in Wales is this luscious kind of fairy tale land, and I think that for me was always this sort of magical sight, and I think this little girl was just, like things like magic mushrooms and things like that. She would tell me about this, more as an adolescent, not as a child, but it's this kind of like England has that possibility, with Druids, with pagans, and I think it's kind of, we're very fortunate to also like be able to tap into these things, and it's
have you been to Avebury?
I haven't. I know about it. Yes, I have friends.
It's a really interesting place. I took my students last year, and it's a really, really interesting place. I mean, there's of course always, again, to these places which have this pagan ritual sometimes incorporated. I think sometimes it can go into a direction of being a little bit like with all human things, can get a bit out of control, and you know, but it's a certainly very powerful place. And Derek Jarman did a film called Return to Avebury, or A Journey to Avebury.
When I left the UK, actually, before going to Mexico, I went to Tennessee, and I was living there with a community called the Radical Fairies. And the Radical Fairies are a group from, I can't remember which decade, but maybe 70s, that they rejected in New York, the kind of commodification of gay culture. And they started going to these other places and created a commune in Short Mountain in Tennessee. And in this commune, what started happening was, first of all, a reconnection to nature, which, you know, now so many people are kind of connecting into that. But at the time, at the 70s, they were very kind of profoundly sort of trying to rearticulate domesticity, which is something for me really kind of magical, when the domestic becomes something else, you know? It doesn't become like a chore, like let's clean up, but it becomes something because it's done as a community, as a commune. So when I was there, they just ritualize everything, you know? So it became like, you know, like cleaning the dishes, cooking, you know, there's like, we do a circle before eating together, like a large circle. This is on the biggest ceremonies. But it was just this kind of really graceful place to be at. And at the same time, there were parallel to it, particularly in Beltane, in this festival, there's lots of micro groups joining together to create a lot of advocacy. So it becomes very political really quickly, you know. So you have this hyper spiritualized domesticity in which everything is ritualized, and then parallel to that, particularly in the US, what I find is that they're very well organized, you know. They go and then, okay, so there's advocacy for AIDS, anti-stigma and AIDS policing, for example, queer, trans, so on and so forth. And they will get together, including myself, in these smaller groups to create advocacy and to create very organized strategizing for this to happen, you know? And so I think there's something of the kind of the magical that is connected to the political, you know? That I find really kind of important, and kind of, you know, the sort of, when the domestic is ritualized, but when the political is also part of this sort of place of a charged body, you know, a body that is within community, that can enter sites of joy, you know, as well. And I think, there's a lot to be said.
I think it's interesting that you're mentioning political in connection to magical. We could now look back at your work and just in these grand gestures that you seem to be inclined to, there is always something very powerfully political, right? And I mean, maybe just even looking at the history of protest, you know, the Boston Tea Party, or you know, protests when milk is spilled and things like that. So I just wonder, maybe in the hierarchy of your making of art, how important is the political? Because I think in certain instances, I feel like maybe it's suppressed sometimes, either because sometimes there is something quite magical about the scale in which you operate. But then there is also that resonating political aspect of doing these grand gestures, of spilling things, and which is very protest related. So,
I mean, I think the word that I like to use at the moment is, there's something about being in the kind of the spark of what a kind of an anarchic gesture can do, you know. And I think I'm just want to talk about a place of not enchantment, but kind of seduction. So it's kind of, when I see these things, I really trust when I'm kind of seduced by something. It can be an image, it can be an article, it can be whatever, an object, it doesn't really matter. But I think I have a good compass to see when that kind of seduction, it's almost like an eroticism to things that are pulling me in, you know. And when I find, and it can be a textual, you know, it can be a novel, it can be a fiction, it doesn't matter. But I think what I'm trusting is that some of these things that are pulling me in usually have quite a transgressive quality to them, you know. Transgressive, they're transgressing something there's a charge of transgression in them, So I follow the spark of that transgression. So that's usually the kind of the igniting seduction or eroticism that draws me into a lot of these things, you know. So I'm kind of trusting that. I think intuition is an important.
But that's the starting point.
It's my methodology. I have to trust in my intuition of how I'm kind of drawn onto these things. Well, then the works become very conceptual, but there is a kind of seductive, erotic process in which I'm drawn into these things and enchanted by
that. Is that fetishization as well? Is there something fetishist about it? And again, maybe this is the moment to actually talk about maybe you know, fetishization of something is always used as a kind of negative.
Yes, yes. No, this is a complete positive. This is something about trust and intuition, because, you know, I can have an image on my wall in my studio. Like I had one of bananas, this image that I found years ago, this pile of bananas, green bananas that had been dumped in the Canary Islands. And that image is one of these images that struck me. You know, when it strikes me, it hits me. And if it sticks, it sticks. And then that kind of becomes foundational in the way that I will make work years later. You know, for example, a piece I did at the TEA Museum in Tenerife, which is this burial of bananas, green bananas. It was like years later. So what I'm trying to say is there's something about the intuitive compass, trusting that, and then from them building something that, what I'm trying to say is that these images or these articles or these things that are like the archive that from which I work from, generally speaking, have a kind of a charge of, or a spark of transgression, in which people or the gesture itself has something in it that for me is anarchic, can be humorous, and in itself it's holding a lot of the things that keep me excited and going. So excitement, you know, it's erotic, it's sort of, I'm essentially aroused, you know, metaphorically speaking, by the possibilities of what this thing looks like and acts like, you know, what that action is doing in the world in terms of an object.
But what is the source of eroticism? Is it the almost like the aesthetic power?
It's the aesthetic, but it's also the gesture. It's the gesture, because it's something about being. There's an anarchism in this, and anarchism, the kind of anarchic gestures that I'm kind of interested in, as some that are.
So would you say that it's not always political?
It is. It always is political, but I think it's difficult to. I mean, in my case, it's difficult to disengage the political from anything we do. I think the political is always around the corner in everything we do, or particularly in everything that I might be doing. You know,
is it about protest? So when you expose these green bananas on the volcanic landscape inside of a gallery, right? Which is what you did in that piece.
Yes, it's a burial. Yeah, I mean, it's a multi-layered work. First of all, you know, like any artist, it always has like a kind of a certain ecosystem in which the work.
That's what I would like to maybe explore a little.
I mean, I think the work hierarchy is problematic for me, because I think hierarchical thinking in terms of priority is, I think it's more of an ecosystem in which things are coexisting between each other. And what I mean by things is the politic, the gestural, the aesthetic, the object, the shape, so on and so forth, and the interrelationship. From if we start thinking, we cut away like hierarchy, and you know, particularly pyramidal hierarchy, and go into a network of an ecosystem in which things are like, it's like a living entity, and things are correlated to each other and connected to each other. And so at times, one aspect of these things would be more present or more nourishing the network more. And at other times, it could be another one. And that will be varying in my practice, you know, as I go through it. But very often, you know, there's something about color as well. I mean, I'm just going to take it to something really blunt. You know, there's something about the shocking possibility of color.
Yeah. Well, let's say in the Tenerife piece, the yellow and the dark gray.
It's exactly. There's this dark lava. You know, I created like a kind of a mountainous thing, very large, 60 meters long, of lava, 4 meters high, and that it's cut through like a slash, you know, of bright green when the bananas are, you know, it's very painterly as well. You know, there's that kind of formal aspect, which is also quite core to the work I do. It might not be the initial igniting thing, but I just also trust erotic or kind of pulls and directions that are being pulled by things like color, smell, you know, like smell can become very important.
So Rafael, I think this is so such an important conversation to have, actually, because I think there is a tendency to extract one thing out of a work of art and present it as the work of art, you know, but what you've just explained is that there isn't, well, you've explained it on the case of your work, that there isn't that one thing.
It's always multiple, yeah.
Yes, and is there? I mean, in my question, I wonder whether you could critique the art world, or sometimes the way we perceive art, or sometimes the way art is spoken about, or maybe even the way some artists operate.
I mean, I don't know if I need to critique it. What I would say, I think there's something about the dissemination of the conversations around art happening textually in, you know, on papers, on articles, and so on and so forth, that usually try to target, you know, this just comes from how magazines and, you know, articles work. They try to target key ideas. And it's, you know, it's like if you just push it, it's like Twitter, you know, people try to reduce everything to a core, strong foundational kind of statement on something. And I think that's the beautiful thing about conversing like we're doing today, is that it allows for, in my opinion, a more kind of open site to be inhabited between you and I. And then I'm trying to kind of reject this thing, oh, it's this, or it's that, or this is the priority. Well, I'm just trying to, it's oscillating. That thing is oscillating. The political versus the kind of gestural versus the aesthetic, the object, you know, and those things are also co-happening at the same time. So I think it's interesting to think about art as this sort of entity, or what, I can't remember which word I used, but this sort of network or ecosystem, like an ecosystem of these various things. Yeah.
And actually, maybe even back to the example that I used earlier, the let's say the Boston Tea Party, or the spillages of milk, which we've seen around the world, wherever sort of the makers of milk protest against the prices that are set. Actually, what's compelling in it is actually also the whiteness of the milk.
Exactly.
Actually, the compelling element is the aestheticism of that moment.
For me, what is interesting there is that the aesthetics are being transgressive, because something that is very docile, like a glass of milk, you know what I mean? We forget about the glass of milk is, you know, whoever drinks milk, whichever type of milk you drink, it's in your fridge and you pour it and you contain it in a glass. So for me, a lot of the work is things that all of a sudden are no longer containable. Yeah. So something that's contained, that we contain, we have human power over it. All of a sudden, it's spilling, it's dropped, it's thrown, it's dumped, it's smudged. This containing, breaking apart, or being open, it's a very small thing that talks about larger stuff. So for me, this idea of not being containable, or things that are like explosive or beyond containability, is a core transgression that I'm very curious aesthetically, formally, conceptually, poetically, politically. Yeah, it's where a lot of my work, you know, begins, is from that formal thing of something not being no longer containable. Yeah.
And so do you feel constrained in some of the things that you would like to do or wish to see, but perhaps it's not really appropriate?
I mean, I have projects. I mean, I want to stop. Like, I have projects that are very minute and intimate in scale, and I'm working at that kind of scale as well. But I have projects that are very, you know, I'm trying to do a project in Córdoba in southern Spain, in which the Roman bridge, which is a UNESCO bridge, I'm trying to block it with 30,000 kilos of potatoes. And I think, you know, it's a grand gesture again, but it's something about stopping the bridge, creating a barricade. People can't move across that bridge temporarily. So, you know, it's sort of, I'm not constrained because it's just somehow I'm very fortunate that, you know, somehow I'm still working, I'm making work, and I get commissions, and, you know, I'm very fortunate that I'm able to sort of continue, well, at this stage, continue making works at scale that I'm happy with, you know. But just going back a little bit about the uncontainability, I think it's also, the poetics is also very strongly an important element in my work. You know, poetics and politics are together. And I think, you know, things like metaphor, a lot of these uncontainable formal things that are kind of spilling over are also speaking about a lot of other things that are, you know, kind of marginal. And what I mean by this is sort of people, communities, voices, that can no longer be contained, you know, that have been silenced and are exploding. So you know, going back to my body, I trust my gut, I trust my intuition. And my gut, people that are gutsy are responding from a place almost like beyond the rational, you know. So this is when people throw things, when they're angry, you know, that gutsy response is something that I need in my life. You know what I mean? I need to also be able to access that. I have been in situations in my life in which I haven't had a voice to speak, you know? So then you're like, fuck, what do you do? So when other people express themselves beyond words, you know, it's about language as well. It's a place that I'm like, okay, they're doing this, you know, they're throwing this, or they're dumping this, or they're spilling this, or they're, I don't know, they're doing these gestures that are speaking about all these other things. So, you know, the metaphor is also very important in my work as well, I would say.
But it's I think the remarkable thing is the scale. And I just wonder whether the scale is, and I know we've spoken about this before, and you have said, I mean, you can repeat it now, but you have said that you maybe don't have a really strong sense of scale.
I mean, the thing with me is that, which it's kind of, it's for me, when I'm thinking about works and when I'm drafting works or whatever, I don't have limitation. You know, I allow myself not to be limited. And I think I feel fortunate that that's the case. And then it's a case of then entering the real world and just kind of liaising with curators or institutions or public spaces and thinking, how can we make this happen? You know, but I always depart from the magical place of possibility, full possibility of action, you know? So it's kind of what you said before, like the idea of bracketing, like you suspend the thing that will stop something from happening, being in your head, and you allow your head to imagine. You know what I mean? And I think I have quite a good stream of that possibility to allow myself
Absolutely.
to imagine.
And I must say, I admire the lack of limits in which you, I guess, start to think about work. So I admire that lack of boundary. But then one of the reasons why I admire it so much is the amount of constraints that I feel the art world puts on itself, you know, when it comes to justifying resources or the scale of the work. And so I think that, you know, you're someone who's very aware of those problematics of doing certain things.
Yes.
But then at the same time, you're to push through that and imagine something that this could be.
I mean, I think that's the greatest resource that artists have, in a way, you know, that kind of like channel of imagination, or, you know, it's almost like a source of the imaginative it's like a methodology of possibility, creating possibilities, formally, whichever way you work, you know. And I think, thank universe for that, you know, that is there, and we artists access that thing, and that's why, like I was saying before, I'm excited about art, and I will always be, because there's always people that are, you know, pushing things or working through things in a way that I just had a block with, you know. like I said before, like Traja's work last night. I'm like, I said to Traja, like I wrote to him and I said, Traja, I want you to anoint me. I don't know how you say this word in English, but you know, like when the king, now we just had the king being anointed, like with oil.
Oh yes.
And I said to Traja, like, hey Traja, like I want you to anoint me with this freedom, because he's freer than me. He's freer in the way that he's using hyper effective basis through music that I feel constipated with. And I'm like, Traja, please anoint me. And this summer, I created this school with a collective in southern Spain, and it's called the University. The bent, well, it's torcida, which is a Spanish word, which is different from bent, but it's the non-straight torcida, bent University of Asilvestrada. So Asilvestrada is a kind of rewilding, but not the British rewilding. It's sort of untamed university. So we are this group and we do this stuff. And we did a baptism of 4 of us. And it was really hot, and it was deliriously hot in like July in Cordoba, like 40 something degrees at night. And it was, the whole thing was this kind of delirious heat and the kind of losing of things that made sense. And we did this baptism together in which we allowed ourselves to start getting, you know, less and less linear, less and less cohesive, and more open to these other things. And I think I'm all for that, you know. That's what keeps me going. That's the erotic. That's the charge that keeps me going forward in my own lived experience and in making as well. Yeah.
Another thing that we were talking about is this idea of multiple lives of an artist. With you especially, and many artists that I meet, one of the most fascinating things is to uncover all these different lives. So we were talking about a mutual friend whom I was really intrigued to find out what they were in their 20s, in their 30s, in their 40s, etc. And somehow in each one of those categories of life, they were something else. And so, or even multiple things, but somehow always different things. So maybe that's what this openness allows you to do, to move. So what do you think you are now that you were not 10 years ago and that you were not 20 years ago?
I'm more committed. It's like I'm more committed to art. It's like a kind of, I don't want to say monogamy, but it's kind of, it's sort of, it's taken over everything, you know? And maybe in my 20s, I was very committed, but I was still quite polyamorous with other stuff as well, with the rave scene, with the, you know, the club scene. And now I think it's kind of, it's in my 30s, it just took over, and it's this kind of weird, like I said, like addiction, you know. So it's kind of, in my 20s, I allowed myself, you know, like to do a lot of traveling and be abroad. And I was very lucky, as I said, to live in Mexico. Like I can't do these things right now, you know. I have too many commitments to all of a sudden like be a kind of this person in a commune for like I don't know how many months, you know what I mean? It's like financially I can't do it either, but it's sort of, it's these things that now the art is nourishing me with those things now. And I think that's what keeps me excited, that those possibilities are invested in the art. And the art is also like has a lot of things around it. Like I was saying before, like this friend of mine who's a hypnotherapist, who is then connected to all these other communities, you know, like sacred medicine communities and so on and so forth. And I think this is what the new art world is capable of. And it's quite like I said before, we are in a very, very incredible times in which things, the shift of things is, we are inside a revolution. Paul Preciado says we're inside a revolution, but we're kind of not realizing that the level of shift that is happening beyond the technological, but more at a kind of level of consciousness. And
the level of consciousness,
but the level of consciousness is also the level of behaviors. And I think, you know, I have friends that are like, that they were heterosexual and now they're moving beyond that. You know what I mean? And it's sort of, I think everything has been fortunately taken to the kind of, how do you say, like the blender. Everything has been blended. Nothing makes sense anymore. So we're in this kind of hyper knowability of what things meant and what things can. And I think now is a very possible place of what things can become. It's difficult. It's scary not to be able to know what things are anymore, you know, for many of us. And for some people, it's so scary that they're, you know, they're in so much fear that they're trying to, like, you know, make everyone suffer from the fear. And it's terrible.
It's always interesting to think, what is that knowledge that exists, but we're not grasping? I always have an issue with that part of the history of art where they say that, you know, one point perspective emerged in Renaissance, so that we suddenly became aware of perspective in Renaissance, and that's part of the development of the brain. But actually, when you look at Greek and Roman sculptures from 1,000 years earlier, just being able to sculpt a body like that implies the most precise understanding of perspective and that sort of three-dimensionality. But you never know where the knowledge is manifested, right? So the knowledge is there. It's we live with it, but it might not be manifested in the, almost like in the profession that we are wedded to. And it's interesting to think about those how those things begin to merge and communicate. And maybe we are, as you say, maybe we are in some form of new dawn.
Paradigm. I think we are. I think we are. I think it's that
we will be able to actually take that knowledge, and maybe that knowledge transferal becomes a lot more, as you say, fluid. Or
I think people are doing it. I think, you know, particularly in gender and queer communities, they're really working beyond the binary now. And I think that's just such a core, powerful, potent place for everything to shift, you know, for everything to be more than the binary, more than the two, you know, more than the black and white. And all of this pluriversality, you know, starts happening. Like, we're not one universe, we're many echo visions coexisting together. And the moment that I realized that in my own experience, you know, that there are other worldviews coexisting at the same time, then my world doesn't become central. It just becomes another possibility within the many possibilities. And then we can access all these other, or partly, no, I don't know how fully, but we can access, or we can expand, or our worldview can kind of become porous and then expand onto other worldviews. And you can get other parts of those worldviews into you. So that's this ecosystem. I think this is a good word for me. Like, it's an ecosystem that now all of a sudden in this network, other islands can come in, you know, but truly come in and really shift what the experience of one's life can be. And that's what I quite revolutionary, I would say, you know.
Yeah. But, I mean, what's also interesting is to maybe think for a moment about the influences on your work, and maybe look at historical references or influences, then almost start to unpack them and not necessarily contextualize them in the present moment, but to almost start to acknowledge layers in their own moment in history. So one of those is actually the way when we connected in the first place is Robert Smithson and Nancy Holt.
Yes.
And I mean, we haven't spoken about this really, but maybe it would be nice to reflect on the contemporary relevance of that work and really of its queerness.
Exactly. Well, I think, you know,
something that in its creation wasn't acknowledged or
no, not at all. And I think it's a really important thing just to talk about the sort of, I mean, I'm more, you know, I studied more the work of Smithson than Nancy Holt, but in the case of Smithson, you know, we can just start looking at some of how the works particularly like, you know, in some of his pieces where there's all these dinosaurs and all these connections to this sort of cosmos and all of this other than this world, you know? Like, I think queerness can be an experience of being very separated from this world and then going into this hyper-imaginary realm in which other worlds are created. You know, that's my experience of queerness, and a lot of my work contains that site, you know, that kind of ecosystem. And I think in the case of Smithson, particularly after some recent conversations with some people, Dan Graham used to say that Smithson was gay. I mean, you can watch this on a video. So is he gay? Is he queer? Was he gay? Was he queer? It doesn't really matter. He had more than a heterosexual sexuality, and sexuality is always affective sexuality. So for me to start coming or addressing the work of Smithson from a place of queerness, a real embodied queerness, is very important, you know? And I think to start realizing that some of these very, you know, kind of cosmos-like pieces have to do with the feeling of not fitting in this world. You know what I mean? Particularly in the period that he belonged to, and the sort of the society that, of course, he had many friends that were queer, but he wasn't out, and he wasn't really allowed to be fully out. And if we look at the early drawings of Smithson, you know, there were hyper homoerotic drawings, paintings, and so on and so forth, with these beefcakes and, you know, like hyper literal, which then started kind of disappearing. And could be slightly controversial, but there is some kind of awareness that maybe Nancy didn't want the work of Smithson to be associated so much with the earlier works, which were more explicitly homoerotic. And so for me to kind of understand that place of Smithson of not being of this world, you know, of a world that allowed him to be, it's very core and foundational in thinking about these kind of quite extreme gestures and site-specific works that he created that were other beyond this world, you know. So, you know, there's always something for me in the reading of Smithson that takes me to a place of queerness, you know, and I think it's very important. And that, you know, I then reflected back to me, you know, it's sort of, and to me and to the people that I metaphorically can connect my work to, you know, beyond.
You could think that in the chains, there is like a potent energy, right? When you're where you're constrained, there is so much potent energy that then manifests and becomes something else, and maybe even that's an element of bracketing. I mean, maybe the bracketing was the sexuality that then allowed some other possibilities or some other expansion of ideas.
Because queerness is very much that kind of, how would I say this word, like this sort of otherworldly experience that can create other worlds within this world as well, you know? It's this unknowable thing, unknowable mechanism that has all this potentiality. And I think in the case of Smithson, it materialized, in my opinion, very personal opinion, in this quite, you know, incredible works beyond the politics of that, you know, a lot of the work of Smithson's are discussed. Yeah.
But this it just comes to me now, the idea of chains and the idea of not fully being able to exercise freedom for various reasons. I mean, sometimes because it's not socially acceptable, but then sometimes because there is like an internal difficulty with acknowledging something or a sense of responsibility to someone. So there are various reasons, or it could be political, you know, in the case of Tarkovsky, you know, his films that were made in the Soviet Union were so much more layered because they had to be layered. He had to cover the criticism of the system with the aesthetic narrative means dreams and things, you know, whereas when he maybe was then away from that environment, some layers were sort of, so to speak, not necessary, and therefore that that multifaceted nature maybe became less multifaceted. So maybe, I mean, that's a general, like something that we can ponder on as an idea, but I wonder maybe whether you could relate it to your work.
Even though we're in very different times, what it means to be a queer person today. I mean, I got brought up in the 80s. So my experience, 80s in Spain. My dad was an agricultural, came from, a peasant family. My dad was born in 1936, the beginning of the Civil War in Spain. He had me in his 40s. So I am the kind of offspring of a time in which homosexuals were killed in Spain. So, it's sort of that kind of ghost, even though I'm post-transition, the transition to the democracy in Spain is there. I grew up with that fear of, that my family grew up in a world, through my Spanish side of the family, in which gays were killed during the dictatorship. So what I'm trying to share here, without extra dramatism, is that the kind of the queer experience, the racial experience, the gender experience, so on and so forth, of many of us, is extreme. It's a place of extremity, even though now, we are living in a different planet, and social media also articulates a kind of dissemination of images and content that somehow makes it look more streamlined. The experience of certain marginalities are extreme, And for many people that I know, there have been extreme experiences. And I still meet people, particularly I met this person who is a refugee the other day, who had to leave because of their status as a person living with HIV in Africa, and moved to London. So there's an extremity to those lived experiences for many people. And as I said, intersectionally for many various reasons, that creates a certain extreme experience of life. And I think, we know so many artists that are connected to that extremity and respond to that lived experience in many, many shapes or forms. So, and of course that, that kind of lived experience is then connected to all these other things that we talk about in this wider ecosystem. But in my case, it is, for me, Southern Spain in the 80s and 90s was a very complex space for me to grow up in. And even though it seemed, I think, like the kind of the transition to a democracy in Spain was very, I think, thin layered. I think that if you just scratch a little bit on the makeup of democracy, you quite quickly access the ghost of Franco in Spain, unfortunately. I mean, even though now things are changing, but we're still haunted by that, and I think it's there. It's going to take generations for this to be cleared out. And I think, but yeah, fortunately, like I said, there's other worlds being created from these experiences. So Paul Preciado is offering, and Jack Harveston, an unworldling of those worlds, and like critical disidentifications of these worlds. Mm-hmm. We critically disidentified with those kind of dirtying, pointing that, we are these creatures that ought not to exist. And from that place of being dirt, pure dirt in all the possible ways, we create another world. And I think that's where I'm at, that I'm hopeful in the new kind of epistemology, kind of the new traditions within a kind of transition of new possible mythologies that we are creating from a queer perspective, that there's sites of possibility that we never even thought about. We can create now new worlds from this quite severe kind of lived experiences. And it's fucking amazing. And this is where I'm at, so there's, from these places of extremity, there's being a response to them, which are quite incredible. And yesterday I was talking about Butol, we think about Hiroshima bomb in Japan, that brought out the Japanese stance of Butol, that was being fueled by the works of Jean Genet, the French gay, queer, radical writer, and theater and playwriter. George Bataille, they took this kind of horrendous experience. I mean, I could never compare my experience to the Hiroshima bomb, but what I can say is that a lot of extremity in the kind of my experience of the queer community. A lot of people have gone through a lot of extremity, and from that we can create these other possibilities. So for me, as I said, going back to this containability, non-containability, when people can no longer be contained within a container. Let's talk about heteropatriarchal containers that no longer we don't fit. At some point, there's explosions. You know what I mean? There's explosions that are positive, explosions that are negative. There's just an uncontainability to being enforced, to behave,
What is interesting is that, of course, the history of queerness doesn't start in 1980.
Well, of course not.
but somehow, I mean, maybe that's the beginning of some form of opening up after millennia of oppression, let's say. But it's also within that oppression and within the cup, within the glass that you're showing, that there is so much, I guess, output that we can now look at and understand as the work of queer artists, writers. And it's in those subtleties of maybe the normative or acceptable nature of those works that maybe some communication with the normative world was facilitated, dare I say. And I wonder whether, and this is a question, whether within explosion there is more potential for a much more conflict, but then maybe that conflict is what's needed.
I mean, I think explosions are very camp things as well. I think camp people, and I very much include myself in this grouping, we can be quite explosive in our gestures. You know what I mean? From my hands to my voice that can go up and down. And I think to just being reactive, for many reasons. And I think conflict departing from a place of, a sort of a queer camp angle is core, it's core that to respond to people that unfortunately cannot deal with a kind of an image of a person an image or an embodiment or an expression of a person that they cannot hold within the brackets of what they think is normative and possible. So I think that for me, the kind of reactiveness of that, how we react from this group outwardly, is core. It's integral to our livelihoods. You know what I mean? It's like if we don't do it, we're screwed. You know what I mean? And I think when conflict or sort of anger or these sort of emotions are survival skills sometimes, you know what I mean, for many communities. And I think within various worlds, within the queer world, within other worlds too. And I think, so I tap into this sort of survival skills, worlds, gestures of conflict, reactivity, explosion, non-containment, again, in various sites. I think for me, they're sites of hope. You know what I mean? When people cannot no longer take it and they just respond. So I think, and they're very, like I said, it becomes a very quite object aesthetic sort of thing that I borrow. They're like readymades of this ecosystem that I then borrow and kind of reshape and do. But ultimately, this sparks, and David Wasanodovic, the Polish New York artist, he talked about the spark. The spark, what he called was a spark against the pre-invented world. I mean, it's a whole ecology of his own vocabulary, but the pre-invented world, I think, let me see if I get it right, it's like a world beyond this world. So it's like a world beyond this kind of convivial heteropatriarchy that he was reacting against. So he's always looking for the spark. And I think the spark is a key word, you know, things that are like sparking against or kind of not engaging in this like pre-invented world. And I don't know, I'm getting a bit muddled up with his vocabulary, but the spark is cool, reactivity is cool, you know, conflict can be really important. Conflict of materials, things that shouldn't touch each other, you know what I mean? Milk with a rope. It's like, that should not be there. The milk is, you know, in a glass, supposedly. Parrots at Goldsmiths College, you know what I mean? It's just materially, when we queer touch of things, surfaces touching together, scales, you know, interrupting other scales, other sides, scales interrupting our own human scale. You know, that for me is important, like the human made small. Abbas Saheri, this great artist, he was saying, oh, you got this really wild scale in which you make people look really small. So, and for me, I never thought about it in that way, because there's something about that, you know, kind of playing that's what sculpture, it's quite an incredible possibility in how we can just play with things.
But there is sometimes a tendency to think that the tools that are in front of us are the tools that we have been given by the oppressor, right? Or the tools that have, you know, made the oppressor, and that we need to reinvent those tools or not use those tools and find different language, find different visual language, find a different language.
Yes.
But in a way, we're still using that language. We're still using those tools. And I just always wonder how do you really, truly reinvent something, and whether that's simply a wrong avenue to explore, or
I think that's for me is not the right avenue. I think we're not inventing anything. I think it's like it's this kind of really wild, constant historical conversation that we are a part of, and we are integrated within it in this flux of history, which
we have all, whether we identify as queer or not, which we have all together built.
Absolutely. Yeah, of course. Absolutely. We're all in it. You're in it. I'm in it, whatever you identify as. And I think, you know, it's a kind of, I don't know if we need to come up with there's so many questions right now about that. Come up with new solutions.
Yeah, there is.
Solutions. Do we need, like, you know, do we just, what do we do? And I think some people are pointing to the ruin right now, collapse. Adestam is one of them. He's saying, like, let's just go into the ruins of this world, not repair things. I mean, I'm just really turning this into a tweet, but it's like, if we go into the world that we created is for me hellish, or for many of us hellish. So like, let's not repair it back to hell. Let's let it fall. So, you know, like Adestam is just looking at all these sites of decay and collapse, and the piers of New York in the 80s, and where like people like Wassano Dobik was a part of, and David Hammonds, and all these amazing, incredible people. And I think it's sort of, I'm kind of there. I'm like, let's let this world sort of collapse into ruins, and let's wait in that unknown of what could sprout out of this ruination. You know what I mean? And I'm quite turned on by that. You know, it's like it wakes me up. And like I said before, just in terms of materially, like instead of going into the light, the transparent, let's go inside the soil. Let's go into the darkness. Yeah. Opacity. You know, like, of course, there's been so much work.
I'm just thinking, have we set an impossible task? And do we need to bracket this and then, you know, do something else? Or it's a thought. I don't know. Well, I guess it's about exploring, right? It's about exploring and seeing whether you get anywhere.
It's a large philosophical question, but it's sort of,
yeah.
I think there's nowhere to go. And I think within this kind of stopping ideas of progression as well. You know what I mean? And
yes,
like, if we stop that kind of methodology of progress and letting things just collapse and seeing what happens. It's quite radical, you know, what people are like, what some people are saying. I mean, I look at John Searson, who's an anarchist primitivist, who's saying like, let's just fully destroy like, you know, technology and just go back into, and it's quite intensive, like an intensified imagination, but it's sort of like, he's like, let's destroy language. You know, he goes really, really far, John Searson. And symbolic languages and all of this stuff. And then, but you know, I'm flirting with all of this.
Yeah.
And I like it. And I think it's kind of like, okay, like what happens? And then when you start flirting with all of these possibilities, it's the maybe. You know, the Trajan Herald gives us a maybe. It's not a yes, it's not a no. What's a maybe? I think the maybe is the non-binary. You know, it's kind of like, it's sort of like, what about a maybe here and maybe there? And like, let's dance with that.
And forms, you know, can things take forms? Can things that we define as certain things actually be in different forms? So, I mean, one thing that I do a lot with my students is to talk about, can an architectural project, we're so constrained by the idea of building. Can an architectural project be an observation? You know, can it be a series of observations or something else, you know? And that's interesting.
That's a queer methodology, you know, queering things. That's a queer methodology. So it's sort of like what's a building? A building is a patriarchal project very often, you know what I mean? It's a male person wanting to remain in perpetuity in the landscape. The most patriarchal thing.
Have you had any weird dreams?
Oh my God, I have weird dreams all the time. Very weird. I mean, trying to remember what I dreamt last night.
Oh.
Let me see if
I can. Every dream is a little bit weird.
But there's something about weird dreams that when you retell them, they start being quite domestic. There's an issue of how do we kind of narrativize in conversation a dream, because sometimes people get really excited, oh, I got to tell you about this dream, and then they tell you and you're like, it can be a little bit like, I don't know, trivial, or kind of the way it's difficult to narrate, you know what I mean? It's difficult to narrate and tell and create a whole world, which is
I guess the easy ones to narrate are the ones where you you know, you're in your flat in London and you open the window and it's...
I mean, I remember what I dreamt last night. I was in my hometown, and I was in my hometown and I was going in a bus down. I lived in the countryside, so going into the town, and then on the bus, there weren't any brakes, okay? So the bus was like going. And then I looked at it, and it's really quite a pretty sight. Like, I looked at the sea, and then in the sea there was the moon. It looks like a kind of a poster from the 90s. Like, and then there was like a whale. I don't know why I'm telling you that this is quite cheesy, but there was a whale. And then I'm like, oh wow, like I've seen a whale in my town. You know, I'm like, wow, this is such a magical moment. But the whole thing was quite manic because the bus was just going into the town and there weren't any brakes and it wasn't stopping where I needed it to stop.